I think is the case for most of us. We grew up probably calling buildings like this the church. I actually say it all the time. I'm going to the church. Yesterday we had a work day at the church. One of Teresa's jobs, and this is how I always say it, is to clean the church. Now, when I'm getting to know someone, one of the things I ask them is, where do you go to church? Or if you're coming here, I may ask you where you're coming from, what church you went to. And literally what I'm talking about is, at least in part, what building you went to gather in. In all those instances, I think that we're suggesting that the church is a building or a place. Now, I want to be clear. I mean, I do it too much to condemn it. I don't think it's a bad practice in itself. I don't think that we're doing anything wrong when we talk about coming to this building and say we're going to the church, as long as we understand what the reality is. Okay? Now, I want you to know something very clearly. I am thankful to God for this building. It is a beautiful facility. Grace Fellowship, those of you who don't know, I'll give you a little history. Back in 1978, when Grace Fellowship was formed, they didn't have a building. They met in the Southside YMCA for a while, and they grew and raised some money, and they bought a piece of property out here on Sibley Road. It looked a whole lot different back in those days. And they built a relatively small building on this property. It's still a part of what you see over there, but just know that what you see across the parking lot is not at all what it looked like originally. I think it's had 3 major additions to it at least, and they happened at various times throughout the church's history, and you can actually spot it by looking at the jigsaw puzzle that is the roof system over there. You see they added a little bit here, they added a little bit there, and by the time I got here in 2000, Grace Fellowship had already set aside, I think, $250,000 for building. And shortly after I got here, we bought the piece of property that this building now sits on. This was a pine thicket. If any of you who were here back in the day, if you remember, it's just a big pine thicket. It looked like Cambodia. You couldn't hardly see through it. And it was so dense. And we bought this property. David Morris oversaw clearing it and got it set up nice. We poured a concrete slab and stuck up a giant metal building, and then by and large, everything that we could do ourselves, we did. And for about 18 months, I spent most of my weekdays, putting on a tool belt and doing many and various things, and some of which I got very good at, but I'm not going to tell you what they are because I don't want to come do them for you. I would think all the time, I don't remember the class on this at seminary. But we did it, though. It took us a little bit longer because we did so much of the work ourselves, but we got it finished, got in this building back in 2006. And the one place that God really showed off in the building of this facility is that probably at the time there were less than 200 people, maybe much less, 150 that were worshiping here, yet we built this building without any debt whatsoever. And it really is God showing off. And if you enjoy this facility, then at some level you kind of owe a debt of gratitude to the generations that have come before you. And I am grateful for the history that I know about this building and this property. And so I guess I'm going to great lengths because I don't want to be misunderstood that I really am grateful to God for this building. It's comfortable. It gives us plenty of space. Above all, it is paid for. And as pastor and as fellow members in the body of Christ here, it's a blessing to us. However, and please hear me, this building is not, has not been, and will never be the church. It is not a house of God. God doesn't dwell here any more than He dwells at your house, your apartment, your trailer, or your townhouse. This is just a building. It is a comfortable box. A building that might one day be destroyed by many and various things. A building that might one day even be sold and used for a different purpose. At the end of the day, this is just a building. But currently, what this building is a place that is set aside for a very special purpose. And currently, this building is where, hear me, a portion of the church meets to worship. Because to be very clear, you and I and many others throughout the earth today are the church. The church is people. It isn't built with brick and mortar. It's human beings that have been transformed by the power of God through the gospel. It isn't a place, we don't gather here because it's a special place. Hear me. We make this a special place by the fact that we gather here. This is true because our God does not abide, set up house in buildings. Now granted, I know that He's everywhere all the time, and even when none of us are here, God's omnipresence is in this building. Theologically, I know that. But what makes this building special and what makes God's presence rich here has nothing to do with the structure. It has everything to do with the fact that we meet here. We make this a church building by being in it. Because He dwells in a special way with His people. Jesus said that where 2 or 3 people are gathered together in my name, I am in the midst. And we may call this building the church. And truthfully, friends, I don't have any problem with doing that. I will probably continue to do it because it's a force of habit. But I'm only okay with us doing that as long as we definitively understand that the church isn't the steel and the wood and the brick. Pray you can hear me. We bought all that stuff from the cheapest places we can find. We didn't interview a single one of them to find out whether or not they loved Jesus. We took the bottom line and made our choices. It isn't the stuff that this building is made out of that makes it special. And it isn't even the particular purpose for which it was designed and built that makes it special. What makes this building special right now is the fact that we're in it. Those saved by the grace of God gathered to worship the living God. This isn't God's house, but we are God's house. It's not this building, it's us. Now, that being true, and I believe wholeheartedly that it is, why do you think it's become so common to call buildings like this the church? I really do think that the reasons for this are multifaceted. But here's one very significant one. There was a time when God did reside in a building. And people had to come to that building in order to worship him. I want to explain to you a little bit about Israel's history. I know we're in 1 Peter. We're still in 1 Peter, by the way. We're going to get to 1 Peter chapter 2 here in a little while. But hang with me. Let's talk a little bit about Israel's history. When God gave Moses the law, within that law was instructions to build a tent. A special tent that would become a place where God would meet with his people. It was called the tabernacle. Tabernacle means residence. Everywhere the Israelites went, even all the time that they were making laps in the wilderness, they took this tent. They set it up when they stopped someplace, and they tore it down when they got ready to move. It was 15 feet wide and 45 feet long. That's a pretty big tent. It had 2 rooms in it. There was an opening foyer that was twice as large, and it was called the Holy Place. There was a second room that was smaller, and it was called the Holy of Holies. That's all the tent had in it. The tent was surrounded by a 75-foot by 150-foot fence, which left a courtyard all the way around it where people would gather and they would make offerings, an act of worship to God. And even though this was just a tent, it was lavishly decorated with gold and silver and fine linens. And listen, it's because when the Israelites left Egypt, God inspired the Egyptians to give them all their fancy stuff. And the Israelites turned around and they used it on the tabernacle. They used this tent for around 300 years. Then David came along, and he wanted to build a permanent structure. But God told David that he couldn't. Ultimately, he said, "You're a man of war. I don't want you building my house." But God did let David make preparation for it. And then David's son, the next king, Solomon, would be the one who would build the first temple. And hear me, the first temple was stunning. It was built on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, 180 feet long, 90 feet wide, with 50-foot ceilings. Just to give you some perspective, this building is 150 feet long, 125 feet wide, and right there where you can't see because it's dark, at the very height is 38 feet. This building would almost fit inside Solomon's temple. It was huge. Even more so, it was huge for that day. There was an edifice built on top of it that extended the height of it to a possibility of even 120 feet tall. And in addition to that, it was immersed in gold and finely crafted woodwork and linens. It was surrounded by huge walls made of stone, and also it was connected to the king's palace and 2 other courtyards. And it took them 7 years to build that temple. 14 years if you count the time it took them to build the palace and the courtyards. And during that time, Solomon conscripted almost every able-bodied man in Israel to come and do some of the work. And it was so expensive at the end of the day, Solomon had to pay the king of Tyre, listen, 20 cities to make up for the debt he owed him for all of the materials and the labor. That building was the centerpiece of Jewish worship for 400 years until it was destroyed in 587 BC by the invading Babylonians. And it lied in ruins for 70 years until the Persians conquered the Babylonians. They released the Israelites to go back, and their king actually funded the rebuilding of the temple. And this second temple, as it's known, was a much less grand structure. Smaller, not as ornate. It's said that it caused the old people who remembered Solomon's temple, they cried when they looked at the new one because they remembered the glory of Solomon's. Now, in 18 BC, Herod, the Roman appointed king of Judea, funded a renovation of that second temple. And that it became known thereafter as Herod's temple. And that was the temple of the New Testament. The temple that the disciples would visit. The temple that Jesus would visit. And I know I've gone into great detail to share with you a little bit about buildings and the buildings that the Israelites used. But I do that to illustrate a few things. The first is this. These buildings were the primary and the designated places that God Himself set aside for His worship. God told Moses to build that tent. And off of that premise, David was inspired to build a temple, and his son Solomon followed through on it. It was that premise that inspired people hundreds of years later to rebuild that destroyed temple, and even Herod to renovate it. This was God's house. In a sense, I know that they could have worshiped God anywhere, but they were not allowed under the law to ignore the worship that took place at the temple. It was special to God, and it was required. It was the place where sacrifices had to be offered. It was central and it was vital. So first, know that that was God's idea. Second, and probably most important for today, these buildings were indeed special places of God's presence. And that's best illustrated by a small piece of furniture that was housed in the first temple and in the tabernacle, known as the Ark of the Covenant. The Holy of Holies, that smaller chamber within the tabernacle and the temple, was walled off by a very thick veil that you could not see through, light could not pass through. And inside that room called the Holy of Holies, there was a special box known as the Ark of the Covenant. It was made of acacia wood, and it was totally inlaid within and without in gold. The Ark held the second set of 10 Commandment stones that Moses carved. Remember, he took the first set and he bashed them. And so it held that second set that Moses carved. It held Aaron's rod that budded. It held a pot of manna, and that's all that was in it. But it had a lid on it, and on the lid, on each end, there was an angel, a cherub. And the angel's wings stretched forth toward the center of the ark, so that each one of them, they were stretching their wings over the middle. And that middle portion had a special name. It was called the mercy seat. And for lack of a better way of saying it, the mercy seat was the throne of God on this earth. It was there that He, anthropomorphically speaking, sat and met with Moses. And also with the high priest that came after him. It was the special place of the presence of God on this earth. And it was so holy that it could not be touched. There's a story, when they were in the wilderness, they had to carry it with rods. And when the Philistines came into invaded Jerusalem and stole it during David's reign, David recovered it, or during Saul's reign. David recovered it during his, and they didn't follow the rule and carry it with rods. And instead, they put it on a cart. And as they were traveling, there was a man walking beside named Uzzah. And he thought the ark was going to fall. And he stretched out his hand and touched the ark. And God killed him on the spot. It was that holy. It was that powerful in presence of God. Made David angry. He had to get over it. But it was so holy that in the days that followed Moses, when the high priest went in, and the high priest only got to go into the Holy of Holies one time a year. When the high priest went in, they would hang a bell around his waist and tie a rope around his ankle, so that if the bell stopped ringing, they would assume that God had killed him and they could use the rope to pull his body out without going in. It was that holy. It was special. And it was by and large off limits to everybody after Moses. Now, this ark was lost after the Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple. We don't know what happened to it. Indiana Jones is not going to find it. I think that it was lost for a purpose. But even the second temple without the ark in it was still God's house. It was the place where worship took place. It was the place where sacrifices had to be offered. It was where the people had to come to worship. It was still the throne of God on this earth. I pray you're able to hear this. And though I don't have time to get into all the details about this morning, I should hope that as we took a whole year and walked through Genesis, and time after time I showed you how all of those stories were meant to point us toward Jesus. It shouldn't be a stretch for you to hear me say this, that the tabernacle and those temples were merely types and shadows that were intended to point us toward Jesus. Because Jesus would come and he would be Emmanuel, God with us, who would come and fulfill the law and change everything by offering us a new and a better covenant. Now listen to the words that Jesus spoke from the Gospel of Matthew. This is Matthew chapter number 23. If you want to follow along, but I'll read it for you. Matthew chapter number 23, beginning in verse 37. This is Jesus speaking. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. Now listen. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus declared over that temple, your house, the temple that God had inhabited. He's saying this temple now is being left desolate. That's the word for something being uninhabited, deserted, left empty. Jesus said, you killed and you ignored the prophets. Those same prophets that pointed you toward me, that pointed toward Jesus. He said, now, like those prophets, you've rejected Jesus. And though God had gathered them back time and time again, they went on rejecting until eventually they rejected the entire purpose of their special status with God, and that was to bring forth a Messiah. All the way back to the covenant that God made with Abraham in the beginning. The purpose of the people of God was to bring forth a Messiah. And they missed it. So now in judgment and prophetically declaring that everything was about to change, Jesus and the presence of God with him left the temple empty. Listen to chapter 24 as it continues. It says, Jesus left the temple and was going away. Now, I'm going to propose to you that that was more than just a physical change of location. It was a prophetic picture that God's presence was leaving and was going to completely leave the temple and the old covenant way of worship. He was no longer going to dwell with Israel in that one spot. Things were about to change forever. And though this was going to be judgment on Israel for their rejecting of Christ, hear me, friends, it's life and salvation for everyone who repents and believes in Jesus. There's more. Listen as he continues in chapter 24 of Matthew. Jesus left the temple and was going away. When his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, and he answered them, "You see all these, don't you? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." This prophetic warning that the destruction of that temple was coming, some 40 years later, the Romans would, or some 40 years later, Romans would invade and they would destroy Herod's temple, which was already going to be left desolate of God's presence according to the pronouncement of Christ. If you want to read the prophecy of what happened in 70 AD, you can see it in the rest of chapter 24 if you wanted to go and read it, where Jesus declared that the generation that he was speaking to would live to see it happen. It's chilling judgment. But hear me, God was moving out of his house. He was moving into a new house. One more passage. And again, I haven't forgotten about 1 Peter. But hang with me for a few more minutes. If you want to follow along with me, I'm going to be in Matthew chapter number 27. This describes what immediately happened at the death of Jesus. Listen to it. 27 verse 50 says, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." As the moment of his death. "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook and rocks were split." Now, Josephus, who really isn't a very credible historian, but he's kind of the best we've got from that time, said that the veil of the temple was so thick that if you hooked it between two teams of horses, they could not have ripped it in two. Yet, at the moment of Jesus' death, that thick veil which protected the entrance of the Holy of Holies, the thing that separated us from the presence of God, was immediately torn from top to bottom as if God reached down and went, and in that moment, God's manifesting presence was loosed out of that room, out of that small area in one small part of the world on top of one little hill. His manifesting presence was loosed and it spread out into the world. And it would continue to be loosed and continue to be spread everywhere that believers come to know him. It was an immediate consequence of Jesus and what he did on the cross. 40 days after his death, Jesus would ascend into heaven. And when he did, he left the disciples a promise. He said, "It's better for you if I go away." Because as awesome as it was to have Jesus, he was still just one man at one place at one time. He said, "It's better if I go away, because when I go away, I'm going to send back to you another." And 10 days after that, his followers gathered and prayed. And the Spirit of God descended on them, and they began to understand what Jesus meant when he said it's going to be better. Because the Spirit of God didn't just come to visit, he came to live. And not just live with them, but live in them. They were filled with the Holy Spirit. They were filled with that other Jesus without a body, the third member of the Godhead, was going to be resident in them in an overflowing fashion. They were filled. They experienced the presence of God that came to abide forever, so strong that it shook the building that they were in. They experienced gifts and signs and power, just like the kind that Jesus operated in. Their ministry became much more effective after that point, as they were transformed into a multifaceted extension of the physical body of Christ in this earth. They became his hands as he worked through theirs, which is part of what Jesus meant when he told them, "You'll do greater things than even I have done." Now, come on, he raised people from the dead, people who had already started to stink. He walked on water, spoke to storms, yet he tells his disciples that you'll do greater things. Well, how can you do greater things than that? It's not an issue of greater in quality. It's an issue of them being greater in quantity. Because it wouldn't just be one man at one place at one time. It would be all of us experiencing and living under the same power that Jesus walked in, able to be his hands and his feet wherever we go. And church, that continues to this day. And it will continue until he returns. And when he returns, it's even going to get better, because it just won't be his presence on the earth. It's going to be the full manifestation of his glory, so great that there'll not be a need for a sun or a moon, because he will light everything. It's going to be so awesome and so overwhelming that you're going to need a fancy new glorified body just to be able to endure it. So I pray you're able to hear me, friends. God has forever left that house. Now we don't go to him because he has forever come to us. Now I pray that you're able to hear what I'm about to say, because some of you have end times theology that this is going to run in the face of. Actually, some of you have end times theology that all of this is run in the face of. But I pray you're able to hear me. God is never going back in that box. That was a type and a shadow. Jesus is the substance, and the substance has already come. So the type and shadow is not needed anymore. Maybe someday there'll be a temple that's rebuilt in Jerusalem. I'm going to be honest with you, I doubt it. Because just practically speaking, for that to happen, it's going to take a worldwide holy war. Because they'll have to take back one of Islam's most holy sites. And Islam will have to be conquered by force worldwide for that to happen. But maybe one day it'll happen. Maybe they'll tear down the dome on the rock and they'll build a temple once again on that spot there, Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. But I want you to know something. If that does happen, I don't think it will, it might. But if it does happen, that new building will be just as desolate as the last temple was. Because God doesn't abide in buildings anymore. He abides with his children. And we won't ever have to go to Jerusalem to worship. And for that matter, we don't have to come to Sibley Road to worship. He has come to us, and He is with us, in us, because Jesus' sacrifice changed everything, and it changed it forever. It's good news. You say, Pastor Brian, does that mean that you ain't for the Jews? And you're not for Israel? I am for the Jews, and I am for Israel. Primarily, I want them to know their Messiah. But I'll tell you, there's never going to be another bull or goat that's offered in sacrifice that will mean anything but a stench in the nostrils of God, because the final, once and for all sacrifice of Jesus Christ has already been made. Now, to quote Wade, that's just my introduction. There was purpose in what I just did. For just a few moments, let me walk you through these verses in 1 Peter. Now, hopefully, with eyes that would see them the same way that the people of the first century would have seen them. Knowing the history and having in your mind the images that these verses would inevitably have inspired in them. 1 Peter chapter number 2, beginning in verse 4. As you come to Him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. Jesus being described here as a stone, but just not an ordinary stone, a living stone that's chosen and priceless to God. But in spite of His value to God, He was still rejected by men. Not all men, but some, primarily the leading Jews of that day. And from that point forward, so many who hear the good news and won't respond to it in faith. And this passage is in part judgment against them for that. But I want you to know that God still has a people. Even though some have rejected Him and will continue to do so, there are still those that He has set aside for Himself that are His special place of habitation, the church. Listen to how He describes us in verse 5. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that these phrases would have elicited mental images of temple worship. The house, the priesthood, the sacrifices. There's no doubt when the recipients of this letter heard that, the temple would have been the forefront thing in their mind. But what Peter is declaring is God is building a new house. And this new house isn't made of quarry stone or fancy wood or laid in gold. It's being made out of living stones. Men and women who have been transformed by their faith in Jesus Christ. It's made out of us. Now listen as he quotes Isaiah from chapter 28. It's recorded in verse 6 here. For as it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in Him will not be put to shame. Jesus is that first stone, the cornerstone, the one that all of the others are laid by. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit I'm not a good mason. David Morris and I have laid block, and after just a little while, I think he basically said, "Brother, I think you're being called to intercede." Just go mix the mud. Go mix the mud. You can do that, So I don't know a lot, but what I do know is this. That when you're building a structure There's something really important about that very first block and that very first stone, because it sets the square for the whole of the building, and everything else will be built based on where that stone is and how it's shaped and placed. Jesus was the first stone, the cornerstone that guides the rest. Jesus is the thing that the rest of us are being built off of, because He made it possible for us to be a part of God's big new house. And being a part of God's new house will never be something that brings us to shame. It won't dishonor us or disgrace us or disappoint us. Jesus is the stone that was laid so that we could be made into this new spiritual house of God. And whenever we come together, whether it's in this building or in one of your homes or with other believers at work or at a providential meeting where you might come across someone in a store, know this: when we are together, God is at home. And that place becomes a special place because we are there. And acceptable worship can take place because God is present with us. Just yesterday, Wade was telling me a story about a group of people who experienced a mass deliverance in a movie theater after watching a movie. And as he's telling me the story, I'm just starting to laugh, because I'm getting these mental images, people throwing their popcorn and just it's like it's just very out of sorts, and it seems like a strange place. But I pray you're able to hear me. Any place we are, when we're together, there's something special. His house is there. Now, I don't want to mislead anybody and make you think that you can't meet God and experience Him individually. You can. You can worship Him when you're by yourself. You can pray and read and sing and enjoy His presence when it's just you and Him. But we have to acknowledge there is something special when we come together, and it is not optional if we're going to grow in grace and knowledge. No house is built with just two stones. I mean, honestly, I don't even know what you got when you just have two stones. You say, well, me and Jesus is a majority. Maybe, but it's not a house. And God has in His mind a great big house, one that will dwarf Solomon's temple, one that was without comparison in human history, and that building requires His many and various living stones coming together as one. Because like any building, weight's distributed by the various parts. The structure's held together by the various parts. Form takes place because things are put together by us being together. God and me, God and you, joining together to build a bigger and better house for Him. One that brings His kingdom on this earth. One that one where His will is being done. One where His glory and presence manifests Himself in special ways. I'll say it again as I started today. I really am thankful to God for this building. It's a blessing. But this building just sits here when we're not here. This building can't worship. This building cannot do ministry. This building cannot serve on its own. This building is a very comfy box, but it's a place for the church to meet. And when you add the church to this building, I think it becomes a place that we can be changed from and the world can be influenced. Jesus saved you, and when He did, He left you in this world, if indeed you know Him, so that you could be part of what He's building. And I pray that you can see that you're here to make God's true house bigger and better, adding your particular shape and function to the structure. Not as a facade or an unnecessary appendage, but as a living stone placed specifically by God to make a habitation for His glory and a place where His kingdom would indeed come. I think it's very intentional that Peter places this passage immediately after he describes us loving one another. Because I actually think that's where everything starts from. As we love God and love each other. Last week we saw how one of the primary reasons that any of us have been saved is so that we can live loving one another. Believers who call this home, and even the believers that you come in contact with that might call other churches home. God saved us and has left us here because He intends for us to love one another. And we may want to reach the world, but Jesus said that the world would know that we're His by the love we have for one another. And I don't know if it was original to him, but I heard it first from Herb Hodges. The light that shines furthest away must, out of necessity, shine brightest at home. So indeed, if you do know Him, I want you to hear me today. You have a place in God's spiritual house. I think it begins with loving His church as one of your primary acts of spiritual worship. Because He made us together to be the church. And I believe that His gathered church does indeed have the power to change the world for His glory. So if you're here today and you don't feel like there's real purpose in your being here, if you view our congregating together as simply a place for you to come and get something, well, I pray you hear me. I hope you got something today. I really do, with all of my heart. But I pray you're also able to hear me. Every time we gather together, we are becoming the house that He wants us to be. Living stones that when we're gathered together as He intended, become a habitation for Him in this earth. That means that all of us need to find our places. You say, well, Pastor Brian, what am I supposed to do? Well, I don't know in total. If you came to me and asked me, I may or may not even be able to give you some good insight, but I can tell you this, find somebody around you and love them. Because that's the immediate context of this passage. That we love each other earnestly. See how valuable you become to others in the body. But there is no person who is in Christ that doesn't have a God-given place and a God-given purpose. In the body and in ministry in this world. My prayer, my hope today is you hear, you don't have to go somewhere else to experience Him. He's come to you. And He made you to be a part of something much bigger than yourself. That is absolutely worthy of you committing your life to.